Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I applaud the previous speaker on what was an overwhelmingly positive speech focused on the government and what it's achieving, and which has been very unusual in this debate from the government side, where most of the speeches have simply been attacking the opposition. So it was good to hear, actually. Good to hear someone from the government who obviously believed in what they're doing, and it's pleasing to hear that there's a government minister who's focused on what they're doing. From the Green Party's point of view, we hope to contribute in a positive way to the political debate in New Zealand this year. We'll be focused on making sure that the discourse around the economy is focused on having a smart but green economy. The government's agenda, which has been to simply focus on more resource extraction, a kind of simplification of the economy, if you like, to making it simpler and simpler. We think that we need a more diverse economy and actually encouraging the green economic opportunities, but also the manufacturing sector, we think, is critical to that. We'll also be focused on making sure that we protect our environment. This isn't only for economic reasons, but that's critical. It's also in and of itself. The Green Party believes that the environment matters in and of itself, and in fact to have rich lives, to have lives that have meaning and that are full of the things that we love, we need to protect our natural environment. Of course, we also need to protect our natural environment to protect our economy. New Zealand economy in particular, but of course all economies are entirely dependent on the natural world, and we degrade the natural world at our peril. It is with some sadness that in recent years under this government, New Zealand's position in terms of environmental management has gone so far backwards. And finally, our third priority area, of course, is about making sure that everyone gets a fair go. We've seen New Zealand now have the highest levels of inequality that have ever been measured, and so as a result, in some degree of the global financial crisis and to some degree the specific policies of this government, inequality has grown quite radically in New Zealand. And that is, I think, a very sad development and something the government shouldn't be pleased with. I wanted to touch a little bit on a few of the contemporary debates. And the first one is the so-called hands-on, hands-off economic policy debate. And the reason is that what I found around the government's approach to this is a little bit incoherent. Because on the one hand, we've had Bill English and John Key to some extent telling us that repeatedly they're a hands-off government. Governments don't create jobs and so forth. We hear from the government all the time. It's the private sector. On the other hand, we hear from Stephen Joyce about their hands-on. And so Stephen Joyce comes to us every day and tells us about specific businesses that he's supporting or whatever. And so he talks about being hands-on. And so the problem, I think, for the government in this debate is that there is an incoherence. Are you a hands-on or a hands-off government? The government can't seem to decide which one it is. And that matters because if the government is going around having a hands-on approach, which is obviously what Stephen Joyce is doing with massive intervention, they're doing it without a theory, without a consistent approach, because in fact on the other hand most of the rest of the government is saying we don't do this thing that clearly we are doing. So there's an incoherence in the government approach to intervention in the economy, and I suspect that's part of the reason why things are going so badly. The second debate that I wanted to touch on was around monetary policy. We've got the official cash rate announcement tomorrow, and no doubt I think it's highly likely it will stay the same, which is relatively high by international standards. The New Zealand interest rates and official cash rate is relatively high. This is a problem for New Zealand, and it's a problem because the official cash rate drives up the level of the exchange rate. The high exchange rate makes it very difficult for our exporters and those who compete with imports. That means we run these big imbalances over time, big current account deficits. To service those current account deficits, we have to sell off more assets or we have to borrow more money, and New Zealand has been doing this for a long time. When the current government criticises the previous government for running current account deficits, it's a fair criticism. The previous government ran enormous current account deficits. It is a problem. But it's not enough just to constantly blame the Labor Party. The current government is the current government, and as much as they want to blame the opposition for their own failures, at the end of the day, they have a majority. And so the fact that we are still running large current account deficits and they're getting worse really does lay at the door of the current government. We do need to change the monetary policy settings. One of the issues has consistently been that what the Reserve Bank has been trying to do is control inflation coming out of the housing sector, and the way it's done that is increasing interest rates, or the official cash rate, in order to try to squash the housing sector. This is in spite of the fact that we know that there are alternative tools available. The Reserve Bank Board got some work done looking specifically at this. Loan-to-valuation ratios, which are able to control housing inflation, is a way to target the inflation coming out of the housing sector without increasing the official cash rate. So this is a tool that is well known, widely used within the developed world, but for some reason New Zealand has been locked into a new right ideological position where, completely out of sync with the rest of the OECD, we have a Reserve Bank that is solely focused on targeting inflation. Most OECD countries do not do this. They look at things like exchange rate, output, employment. And of course that's a very sensible approach. Of course, we also are in the middle of this currency war. Most major economies that we relate to or compete with are putting downward pressure on their currencies through quantitative easing and printing money on a large scale. It's a very strange world where very large economies, the US Federal Reserve, of course, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank is looking at getting engaged in a big way. The Swiss Central Bank are all involved in quantitative easing of one sort or another to put downward pressure on their currencies. And New Zealand, of course, takes a position that we couldn't possibly get engaged in anything like that, and the effect is that our currency is overvalued and our export sector is getting squashed. We set up the manufacturing inquiry, the opposition parties, because we wanted to look at the problem in manufacturing. One of the key problems that the manufacturers and exporters are telling us is the level of the dollar. They're saying it over and over and over again. Other countries' governments and central banks are responding to the cries from the productive sector by intervening on the currency. That is now normal practice within the OECD. Anyone that reads what's going on from the Bank of International Settlements or from any of the international institutions knows that it is normal practice now for governments and central banks to put downward pressure on their currencies by putting their official interest rates down towards the bottom of the band and by using quantitative easing to intervene on their currencies. It is just now normal practice. The fact that New Zealand refuses to do it is part of the reason why our currency is much higher than other currencies. And so Chris Tremaine, who's now shouting out, who I politely listened to his speech, is now, I think, showing great impoliteness by shouting out. In fact, Mr Tremaine, this is normal practice now within the OECD, and if you read OECD documents, as I do on a regular basis, you would see that this is standard debate. And the tragedy is that we can't have a rational monetary policy debate because we get these kind of shouting out that we get from the National Party, which makes it very difficult to have a rational monetary policy debate, as they are having in other countries. In other countries, what they're saying is, how do we protect the export sector, the manufacturing sector, the productive sector of our economy that generates jobs? How do we intervene on our currency to do that? It's not a simple thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. Nobody has the silver bullet around this issue, but it is the debate that we need to have, and unfortunately we're not having it properly in New Zealand, largely because of the government, which is intervening against the debate. At the same time, we now have record high unemployment. So in terms of jobs, which the government should be judged against, it's been a failure. We had the highest level of unemployment since the National Party was last in government. So that tells you their success. In the manufacturing sector, we've lost 40,000 jobs in 4 years. So this is a major problem, and yet the government tells us repeatedly it's not a problem, and they refuse to act about it. And so we're seeing a decline in manufacturing exports. Just in nominal numbers, we've had a 9% decline in the value of manufacturing exports over the course of this government. It has been a failure. We've got record unemployment, decline in manufacturing exports. And then, of course, when it comes to the environment, the government's policy is extraordinary. Since the election, we have seen an extraordinary attack on the New Zealand environment. It is a broadside, led, of course, by Stephen Joyce. Policy after policy is just about attacking the environment. We've seen it particularly with regard to mining. Now, the thing about mining is that, obviously we need some mining, but mining as an industry doesn't employ a lot of people. Never has, likely that it never will. Compared to 200,000 people employed in manufacturing, it's relatively small. And so while the government sits on its hands when we lose 40,000 jobs in manufacturing, its whole economic approach to generate jobs is premised on building up the mining sector. Even if you doubled the mining sector, the employment in the mining sector, it would make a marginal difference to the number of jobs that are being lost in manufacturing. That is how out of touch this government is in its economic policy. It simply doesn't get it. Look at climate change, the same problem. This government has no priority around climate change and dealing with the climate change issues. Mr Speaker, the government has done some positive things. The home insulation scheme was a positive development. But in this term, the government really does not appear to have any ideas.
The Honourable Tony Ryle.
Mr Speaker, the John